What is it with horns and antlers these days? Artists put antlers on deities that never had them before. People wear them to festivals, and Cernunnos and Ellen of the Ways are both very popular. In this video, I'm going to explore some of the reasons for this as best I can. Let's start with a bit of basic biology here, because I know some people don't have experience with animals beyond household pets. Cattle, sheep, goats, bison, and antelope have horns. These start to grow when the animals are quite young, and they keep them for life. Horns have a bony component, which is covered by a sheath of very hard keratin, the stuff hair and hooves are made from. It's pretty common for both sexes of animals to have horns, but if females have them, the horns are usually smaller. Deer, elk, and moose have antlers. Antlers are also made from bone, but the animals shed them annually and grow slightly larger ones at the beginning of the following year. Only males have antlers, with the exception of caribou and reindeer, where some of the females also have them, which they grow and shed at slightly different times of the year than the males. All this might not seem important to what I'm going to say, but it will hopefully stop you going down too many wrong roads if you're pondering things. Don't worry if you've been calling antlers horns. People have always done that. In this video, we'll explore the Greek god Pan, the Gaulish Cernunnos, Ellen of the Ways, and one or two of their possible cousins. I don't normally venture outside of Celtica, but I think Pan is very important to our understanding of how these other deities are perceived today. But just to be clear, I'm not suggesting that the Celtic deities have any direct links to Pan. If you'd like to delve a little deeper into the topics in my videos, you might enjoy taking one of my online classes. You can find out more about them at the link which is on your screen now. You can also support my work on Ko-fi or by becoming a patron. You'll also find free content to read on my Patreon page and on my website. All the links are in the description. Pan is a Greek deity who's part goat, part man, often seen as playing a shepherd's flute or a set of panpipes. Pan originally belonged to a region of Greece called Arcadia. As the crow flies, it isn't that far from Athens, but the Athenians thought of it as a remote place. It's rough country, mainly suited to sheep and goat herding. Not many people lived there, and the Arcadians were considered poor and backward. Not only was it hard to get to Arcadia, but why would you bother? As an Arcadian god, Pan probably predates the formal Greek pantheon by centuries, if not millennia. The seams of the classical Greeks stitching him into their religion are pretty obvious, and he always sits a little awkwardly there. Pan lacked the civilized niceties. He was earthy and uninhibited, and his worship was generally accompanied by the casting off of civilized norms of behavior. Often pictured with a prodigious erection, he was seen as responsible for the fertility of the flocks of sheep and goats. Pan also had an association with warfare, in which situation he seemed to act as a kind of trickster, inspiring a particular strain of panic which caused warriors to turn on their comrades. In fact, this is the origin of the word panic. It's not surprising that the city dwellers of Greece looked down their noses at the Arcadians, but it's also inevitable that at some point they began to romanticize them a little, especially when they were feeling a bit bored or disillusioned by their own urban lifestyle. The people of Arcadia began to be seen as some kind of noble savages, living in a bucolic paradise filled with nymphs and shepherds, and that imagined version of Arcadia was presided over by the sexy, edgy Pan. If the classical Greeks idealized the Arcadians, this was nothing compared to the reinvention of Pan and Arcadia during the Romantic movement in the arts in the 18th and 19th centuries. Largely a reaction to the Enlightenment and increasing industrialization, Romanticism in Europe was obsessed with an idealized vision of peasant life and the countryside generally. Arcadia came to be seen as an unspoilt earthly paradise, and Pan, while he did retain a strong sexual undercurrent, became more about playing the flute while shepherds danced. In Britain, the Romantic period fed into antiquarianism and an interest in the occult. This, in turn, contributed ideas to the Druid revival and the beginnings of Wicca and other witchcraft revivals. Margaret Murray's book, The Witch Cult in Western Europe, published in 1921, was particularly influential in all this. Murray was a highly respected Egyptologist and folklorist who took the position that the women tried as witches in the past had actually been members of witchcraft cults, which were, in turn, a survival of pre-Christian religion. According to Murray, these witch cults worshipped a horned god who was later confused with the devil. Murray had a vast knowledge of ancient religions, many of which included horned figures within their belief system. She was also aware of the folk practices traceable into the early centuries of Christianity, in which people wore animal costumes and masks. Murray came to the conclusion that all these things were connected to one big package labeled Old Religion, in which the horned god was a central figure. Murray's work on witchcraft, which was somewhat outside her normal field of expertise, was met with skepticism at the time, and has been pretty thoroughly discredited over the years since. So we don't need to trouble ourselves too much over whether her theories were correct. They weren't. I think what we need to ask is, why were these ideas so seductive, both to Murray herself and to the many neopagans who refused to stop believing them throughout most of the 20th century? So hold that thought, and let's turn our attention briefly to Cernunnos. Most of us think of the antlered figure on the Gundestrup cauldron when we think of Cernunnos, or maybe this famous carving from Paris. One of the problems with horned and antlered deities in ancient iconography is that the art is often quite stylized, and it's rarely labeled. In fact, this can be a real problem. Pan, for example, is extremely widespread and diverse in how he's represented. Cernunnos may be as well. It kind of depends on what you decide his defining characteristics are. Cernunnos is generally agreed to have the following attributes in how he's shown. He has antlers, sits cross-legged, he usually wears or holds a torque, and is holding or accompanied by ram-headed serpents. There are quite a few Cernunnos statues and reliefs, and a few more that are kind of questionable. It's not uncommon for there to be some ambiguity in ancient depictions of deities. There's a kind of Lord of the Forest or Lord of the Animals type character who appears in a couple of Welsh stories. This is the character who directs Owain to the fountain in the romance The Lady of the Fountain, and who shares some attributes with the giant shepherd Custennin in Culhwch and Olwen. Various scholars have suggested a relationship between this figure and Cernunnos. One noticeable difference is that the Welsh figure carries a club, not a torque and a serpent, nor is he said to have antlers or horns himself, although he's surrounded by forest animals. He's also described as dark or black. Whether this refers to his complexion or his hair color isn't certain, due to the way hair color is referred to in Welsh. Translators of the text are about evenly divided on this. Some call him black-haired, others just black. You will see on the top of the mound an enormous black-haired man, no smaller than 2 men of this world, and he is the keeper of that forest. You will see 1,000 wild animals grazing around him. And the black-haired man was there, sitting on top of the mound, and he took the club in his hand, and with it he struck a deer a great blow, so that it gave a great bellow. And at his bellow wild animals came up until they were as numerous as the stars in the sky, so that there was scarcely room for me to stand in the clearing with them, what with all the serpents and lions and vipers and other kinds of animals. He looked at them and ordered them to go and graze, and they bowed their heads and did homage to him, as obedient men would do to their lord. That's a bit like what the animals are doing in this relief carving. Black or black-haired could be correct, but I can't help thinking of another Celtic deity who's described as sunburned or dark-complected and carrying a club like our forest guardian. And that's Ogmios, who is also described as being a strong man like Heracles and wearing an animal skin. And so this gives us even more ambiguity and less clarity about Owain's Lord of the Animals. Our Heracles is known among the Gauls under his local name of Ogmios. His skin is wrinkled and tanned, as black as any old salts. You would take him for some infernal deity, anyone other than Heracles. Such as he is, however, he has all the proper attributes of that god. The lion's skin hangs over his shoulders, his right hand grasps the club. William Young, in his recent book Ghosts of the Forest, argues that the Lord of the Animals in Welsh literature may not be related to Cernunnos, but instead represents Cocydius. Cocydius is a deity worshipped in North Britain. The Romans sometimes conflated him with Mars, as he's associated with war. He's often depicted with a shield and a sword or spear, and sometimes has horns, but these appear to be proper horns, not antlers. This ram-headed deity may be Cocydius, but it's uncertain. So far, Cocydius has not enjoyed the same popularity in the modern world as Pan and Cernunnos, and that may actually be due to his warlike appearance. I suspect that what appeals to us about Pan and Cernunnos is their closeness to nature in a way that we like to imagine as wild but gentle. So on to Ellen of the Ways. There are two strands to Ellen's backstory. One is found in a Welsh story called The Dream of Maxen Wledig. It's an involved story, which I'll save for another time, but briefly, it tells how a Roman emperor has a dream in which he goes on a long and complex journey where he meets a beautiful princess. He eventually finds and marries this woman, a Welsh princess called Ellen Leddog. Ellen is quite self-possessed, as you'd expect from a sovereignty figure. Among the things she demands of Maxen is that he build a network of roads linking up her various castles. There are still roads in the Welsh landscape known as Sarn Ellen or Sarn Helen, Ellen's roads, probably built by the Romans. Ellen also became Saint Helen, so that's one strand of Ellen of the Ways. The other strand starts in 1983 with a woman called Caroline Wise. Interest in ley lines and megalithic sites was very popular at that time, and Caroline was involved in researching them and worked on a magazine called The Ley Hunter. Part of her research involved spending time at megalithic sites, and Caroline and a friend sometimes spent the night at the Rollright Stones on the Oxfordshire-Warwickshire border. This is a megalithic site which includes this significant stone circle, a dolmen, and a few other megaliths. One night, during one of their stays at the Rollrights, Caroline had a vision of an antlered goddess. Her friend felt something too, but he had stayed indoors, while Caroline was outside when she saw the goddess. Caroline Wise seems like a sensible and down-to-earth sort of person, and whether you choose to believe in the importance of her experience or not, I'm sure that she's entirely sincere. She spent years trying to make sense of her vision without the benefit of the internet for research, of course, and in time she came to connect it with Ellen Leddog and her roads. Of course, the idea of straight tracks crossing the landscape will have appealed to someone already interested in ley lines. Naturally, Caroline also discovered that reindeer and caribou are the only species of deer in which the females have antlers. And it's further interesting that they're migratory deer, which might also connect to the idea of ancient roads or tracks. Caroline also noticed that in quite a few European languages, including Welsh, the word Ellen, or something very similar, will refer to deer, even if it isn't the main or most commonly used word for them. Caroline Wise is very much in the stamp of mid-20th century English neopagans, who tend to be quite eclectic in their interests and in what gods they interact with. So it's not surprising that she connects ideas from many cultures to her understanding of this new, or perhaps re-emerging antlered goddess. I'm not going to go into all that here, but I don't feel dismissive of either Caroline's experience or of the idea of an antlered goddess called Ellen, who may even be in some way connected to Ellen Leathog. Over the years, Caroline kept finding new things which seemed to fit her picture of Ellen and which made sense to her, but none of this was really very well known until, you guessed it, it was spread via the internet. She did write a book early on called Ellen, Goddess of the Ways, but I don't think it sold well and it went out of print quite quickly. Her original internet piece is still there, and she has since published another book called Finding Ellen, which includes chapters by other authors. In the past 10 or 15 years, interest in Ellen of the Ways as a deer goddess has exploded, and she now has quite a significant cult. Caroline Wise is still pretty active on the London pagan and antiquarian circuit, but Ellen of the Ways is only a small part of who she is or what she's interested in. 8 or 10 years ago, I was feeling kind of enthusiastic about Ellen and joined a couple of Facebook groups for people who follow her. I quickly became just as fascinated with Ellen's growing army of followers, as there wasn't much serious discussion about Ellen the goddess in the groups I happened to join. What seemed to be most exciting for the members were seeing deer in their day-to-day lives, which is pretty common in many parts of the world, even in towns, and in deer imagery. There was a constant sharing of deer statues, deer toys, deer candles, and so on, and art featuring women with deer or women with antlers. This seems to be tapping into a wider zeitgeist, with antlered women, and to a lesser extent antlered men, finding its way into popular culture more generally. They turn up in fashion photography and music videos, and are a popular look for festival goers. While you can certainly call this a fad or a fashion, I think that just like Pan, it's part of a wider reaction against modernism in all its ugliness. People see it as a way of signaling their desire to align themselves with nature at a time when many of us feel very dissatisfied with our urban and suburban lives. Cernunnos, too, as you probably know, is one of the most popular Celtic deities in neoPaganism. He's attractive, I think, partly because, besides the antlers, we don't actually know much about him, so he can easily be whatever a follower wants him to be. And while that inevitably means that a lot of his followers are quite naive and probably heavily influenced by fashion, I don't think that means we should dismiss them as fools, and we certainly shouldn't think of Cernunnos as some kind of fantasy deity. He has a solid background in early Celtic history. Cernunnos, Pan, and Ellen all seem to me to serve a similar function for their followers. They reflect our desire to be closer to nature and to preserve it. A longing to get back to the wilds, or at least to some kind of bucolic Arcadian paradise. There's a very real need for that, of course, and it would be wonderful if everyone who follows these deities would actually take action to help nature. For a lot of people, though, this is just escapism, and sadly, there's probably a need for that too.